Right. It doesn't seem that Molana's succeeded in doing that. So I'm going to go into the presentation. I will just give you a presentation in relation to the regulations from a legal perspective. Then, inshallah, we'll have a presentation from a doctor on the medical perspective, Dr. Uzair Mohammed. And then we'll have an explanation of Masail from Mufti Zakaria. And thereafter, there'll be a short discussion on moon sighting, and there'll be a short Q&A. For the purposes of the Q&A, can I please ask the participants to please just type in your questions, and we'll try to get through, inshallah, as many of the questions as possible. Okay, so the starting point for us is the regulations that were issued under the Disaster Management Act. And these regulations were recently amended last week as it related to faith-based organizations. The two relevant sections that I will focus on is section 33F, which relates to the movement of persons, and then section 37(1)A, which relates to gatherings. I should tell people that you don't need to worry about taking detailed notes of the slides. Inshallah, we'll try to make these slides available to the Jamiat, and it will be loaded onto the Jamiat's website or emailed to the relevant participants. Now, let's go to section 33F of the regulations. It provides that a person may leave their place of residence to attend a place of worship in the same or another metropolitan area or district within the same province. So I think there just I need to emphasize that to go to a place of worship, you can only go to a place of worship in the same province. Then the other section is section 37(1) of the regulations, which deals with gatherings. And it provides that all gatherings are prohibited except a gathering at a faith-based organization, which is limited to 50 persons or less, depending on the size for the place of worship. But then importantly, provided that all health protocols and social distancing measures are being adhered to as provided for in directions by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. These directions were also gazetted on the 28th of May 2020 and includes onerous obligations on religious leaders, that would include our imams or persons in charge of places of worship, in our case, either trustees or Masjid committee members. And while I should say that the obligations are onerous, at the same time, I think they're not impossible to comply with. And I think if we keep an open mind, we can comply with these directions. So let's just recap then. For our purposes, a gathering is permitted if it is at a masjid or a musalla, because that would be a place of worship. Number two, it does not exceed 50 persons. And then number three, there is compliance with all the 28 May 2020 gazetted directions. And I will spend some time taking you through some of the important directions. Just can I emphasize that some scholars have advocated that it remains incumbent, even in current circumstances, to stand shoulder to shoulder in Salah. Unfortunately, this would constitute a breach of sections 51A, 251AC of the directions, and those directions deal with social distancing, and I will touch on those directions just now. In relation to social distancing, there's an onus on imams, trustees, and masjid committee members to ensure, firstly, there's no physical contact between persons at the masjid. Secondly, there's a minimum of 1.5 meters between persons. And thirdly, all social distancing measures and health protocols are adhered to at all times. Therefore, my plea to those scholars who believe that it is incumbent to stand shoulder to shoulder in Salah, even in the current circumstances, is to observe the directions and beg the Almighty's forgiveness for the shortcomings that may arise by virtue of the failure to stand shoulder to shoulder in Salah in the current circumstances. If we ignore these directions, we need to appreciate that we're exposing our imams, our trustees, our masjid committee members to criminal liability. We're also going to expose musallis to potential harassment by law enforcement officers. And more importantly, we undo any gains that may have been achieved in convincing the government to relax the restrictions. We need to be careful that we do not start behaving in a fashion that results in government reversing some of the relaxations, particularly if we start seeing a significant increase in the infection levels and the death rates. Just on that score, I'm told that already when you take into account the COVID-related deaths in South Africa, the proportion of deaths of Muslim people is disproportionate to the amount of Muslims there are in South Africa. I should also just touch on the fact that there are local and international examples that places of worship present particular risks. In particular, because individuals in close proximity facilitate the virus to be transmitted. I accept that that's if Allah wills, but that often happens via droplets or fomites. And just to deal with examples of congregations where this sort of thing had happened, a member of a church in South Korea attended a congregational prayer, and he was then diagnosed shortly thereafter on 18 February 2020 with COVID-19. Within 3 days, there were 15 other reported cases of people testing positive for COVID-19 from that particular congregation. And this in turn then contributed to 5,080 positive cases of South Korea's 9,137 cases as at the 25th of March of this year. Just closer to home, in the Free State in South Africa, 5 tourists attended a prayer meeting between the 10th and the 11th of March, and they later tested positive for COVID-19. Soon thereafter, at least 67 other congregants from this prayer meeting also subsequently tested positive, with 3 deaths having been linked to this particular cluster. And this cluster then provided seeded cases for people in a number of other provinces. Just when we're dealing with cases in our communities, members of the Mayfair community have been infected. We're told that there is 2 brothers that are currently quite critical in ICU, and let's make dua that the Almighty gives them shifa and a speedy recovery. But we've also had information that an Asia resident passed away last night after having tested positive for COVID-19. There's also been details of a Hindu couple in Indonesia that passed away today, also after having tested positive for COVID-19, and 7 of their family members also since tested positive. So just my message to you is, let's be careful about suggestions that this virus is no different to the common flu, and let's educate our communities about the dangers and encourage them to take precautions. Just as far as that's concerned, you'll see in any event the directions places those obligations on the imams, trustees, and masjid committee members, and I'll touch on that just now. I'm going to go very quickly to the groups that are at higher risks for serious complications. Firstly, people that are 60 years and older. Secondly, people with an underlying chronic medical condition, particularly if those conditions are not well controlled, and those conditions include diabetes, chronic lung disease, including moderate to severe asthma, active TB, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I think for short they call it COPD, and I'm told that many regular smokers end up with COPD. Then you've got moderate to severe hypertension, moderate to severe heart conditions, and kidney or liver disease. Severe obesity is also a category of people that are high risk, and this particularly relates to people with a body mass index of 40 or higher. And then there are a group of people with immune systems that are compromised as a result of cancer treatment, bone marrow or organ transplants, HIV or AIDS, prolonged use of corticosteroids or other immune weakening medications. As far as the symptoms of COVID-19, and this is as published by the World Health Organization. The most common symptoms are fever, dry cough, and tiredness. The more serious symptoms are difficulty in breathing or shortness of breath, chest pain or pressure, loss of speech or movement. And these symptoms will become important when I talk to the directions later. And then less common symptoms are aches and pains, sore throat, diarrhea, loss of smell or loss of taste, nausea, vomiting, or weakness. Just as far as the directions that were gazetted are concerned, Section 2.2 of those directions provide that they apply to all religious gatherings and to persons entering places of worship. The other thing we need to be alive to is Section 3.3 of the directions provide that there has to be 30-minute intervals between services. This may make it difficult to have more than one congregation in the same masjid for any salah. I do have concerns about some of the communities having rolling congregations with 15-minute intervals, and also I'm not sure whether they're making any provision to cleanse and sanitize the place between those congregations. If not, that is potentially a breach of the directions that have been gazetted. Just as far as the imams, the trustees, and the committee members are concerned, there's an obligation in Section 4 of the directions on them to ensure that musallis wear a face mask covering their nose and mouth. And then there's the obligation to develop a plan which incorporates measures set out in the directions. The plan should ideally be in writing and stored in a file together with other documents such as the directions that was issued by government. There'll be IMA guidelines you can put into that. Any information about COVID-19 you can put into that. Information about sanitizers being used. I think this is particularly important because when we get later, you'll see that there's a requirement that the sanitizers have to have at least 70% alcohol content. And I've acted for a number of call centers that were operating way back in level 5 already. And often when they had visits by the police were not just satisfied that there was a container there with sanitizer in it. They often wanted to check that it had at least 70% alcohol in those containers and often threatened to close the place if the call center could not prove that the sanitizers had at least 70% alcohol content. Then you can also, in your planning document, deal with the personal protective equipment being provided to the imams and staff members monitoring compliance with directions and protocols. My personal view is that we as a community should be making sure that our imams and our committee members that are monitoring compliance are given more sophisticated personal protective equipment by the relevant communities, because they're going to be in the front line. And obviously we don't want our imams or our committee members that's monitoring compliance and doing the coordination to ensure that our mosques remain safe being infected. Then in relation to staff employed at the masjids, there also has to, in addition, be a workplace plan, and that is in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. As a minimum, I suggest that you include in there details of all the staff together with all pre-existing conditions, details of training provided to the staff in regard to the dangers of COVID-19, its symptoms, and the measures to take to reduce the spread of COVID-19, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willing. Then the imams, trustees, and committee members also have an obligation in terms of Section 4 of the directions to develop and maintain protocols on how they will ensure that there are no more than 50 musallis at the masjid at any time. These protocols are not stipulated, but the IMA has published a useful document indicating, for example, that you can have a pre-booking service through a website or a pre-registration service via an app, or alternatively, you can have random allocations or alphabetical or address-based allocations on a daily basis, another way that's been adopted by many communities is a first come, first served basis. The problem with a first come, first serve basis is that if we have musallis that don't exercise patience and self-discipline, then the first come, first serve basis may prove to be problematic. Then, just a word of warning for the Imams, trustees, and Masjid committee members is that some members of the community may adopt the stance that no one is entitled to prevent them from entering the Masjid or from imposing conditions on them when they are in the Masjid. The simple answer to these people is that none of us live on an island. We have obligations to each other. And if there is a breach of the directions, we're not only exposing them to issues, but we expose the imams, the trustees, and the masjid committee members to potential legal liability. And we could also affect the ability of the relevant community and other faith-based organizations as well. And we could face the reversal of the relaxation of the regulations. So please, again, I'm urging people, let's do our best to try to comply with the directions. Then every masjid must, in terms of section 4.2 of the directions, implement the following health and safety measures. Firstly, you got to screen potential musallis for fever, a cough, a sore throat, shortness of breath, or difficulty in breathing. I link back to the slide where I dealt with the symptoms, and you can see why government has included this in the directions. You also require every potential musalli to report any body aches, loss of smell, loss of taste, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, weakness, or tiredness. And such a person that displays such symptoms may not enter the masjid unless that person has self-isolated, submitted for medical examination and testing for COVID-19. And the relevant section there is section 4.4 of the directions. And then if a person tests positive, they must immediately inform the imam, and arrangements should then be made to identify the people that may have been in the same congregation as that person, so that the risk of transmission for such persons can also be assessed. And I'm sure that Dr. Uzair will elaborate further on that issue. Then let's get to sanitizers, disinfectants, and other measures. The directions provide that a hand sanitizer with at least 70% alcohol content or a generic alternative with a similar sanitizing effect, which is in accordance with the recommendations of the Department of Health, must be made available at the entrance of and in the masjid, which all musallis are required to use. I suggest that the committees, if they don't have information on the recommendations of the Department of Health, that they liaise with the Islamic Medical Association and see if they can assist in establishing what the Department of Health recommendations are in regard to generic alternatives, particularly because there's a school of thought that suggests it's not permissible to utilize hand sanitizers with alcohol content. But having the sanitizers is not the end of the obligation. In addition, the masjid must ensure that there are facilities for the washing of hands with soap and water. So these are not alternative obligations. They are obligations that both have to be complied with. So you have to have the sanitizers, and in addition, you have to have facilities for the washing of hands with soap and water. And the relevant section there is section 7.2b. Then, as far as wuzukanas and toilets are concerned, there seems to be a misconception that the masjids are obliged to close wuzukanas and toilet facilities. The good news is there's no express prohibition in the directions, but be alive to the fact that if you're keeping your wuzukanas and toilet facilities open, all of those toilets in common areas, your door handles, and in addition to that, electronic equipment and objects are to be sanitized as regularly as possible to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Also, in fairness to the communities that have elected to close the wuzukanas and the toilets, I'm not surprised because medical experts have opined that such areas can be hotbeds for inspection. And therefore, I still recommend that even if you're keeping a small part of your wuzukana open, musallis must be encouraged to make wudu at home and to use the toilet facilities at home. The facilities available at the mosque should really be for emergency situations. But as I said earlier, it may still be necessary to keep part of the Hukana open so you can comply with the obligation to have a facility for the washing of hands with soap and water. Then there's an express prohibition against the sharing of equipment, objects, and religious scriptures. Therefore, you're well advised to ensure that your Qurans, reading material, tasbihs, jubbas, and topis are not available during this time. And musallis are advised of this in advance so people don't get upset about that. And they understand that that's in order to comply with the directions. And then section 7.3a of the directions provide that all surfaces and equipment are to be sanitized before and after the next religious activity commences. Somebody ideally needs to be given the responsibility for this, and the written masjid plan should include details of who has this responsibility. Then there's an obligation in terms of section 8.2 of the directions for a masjid to keep a register for at least 6 months with at least the following details of each musalli. Number 1, the residential address. Number 2, cell phone number, landline number, or email address. And number 3, contact details of persons living in the same residence as the musalli. Some communities have gone further and have asked people for details about pre-existing conditions. All I can say is that a lot of the communities are using electronic platforms to capture some of this information, and while that's all a very good way of doing things, please try to ensure that you're using secure platforms so people's personal information is not compromised, particularly if you're also asking people to give information about pre-existing conditions. Your written masjid plan should ideally also include details of where the register is stored and how it is to be kept safely, and to the extent that it's being kept electronically, what steps have been taken to try to ensure that it's on a secure electronic platform. Then just some additional considerations I want to take you through. Section 8.3 requires all musallis to be informed of the dangers of COVID-19 and how to prevent it. I think a practical way to try to deal with this is to put up posters or have posters prepared dealing with the dangers of COVID-19. I'm sure the doctors and members of the Islamic Medical Association can also help in this regard. Then social activities before and after Salah is not allowed. Masjid should ideally have, in my view, a COVID-19 subcommittee. We should consist of the imams, the muazzin, medical professionals, at least an architect or an engineer, and then a legal professional who's familiar with the regulations and the gazetted directions, so that you have people with diverse expertise considering issues and developing appropriate plans and protocols. And then the plan should include responsibility on particular people to ensure that the area where the salah is going to be performed is properly ventilated. So making sure, for example, that windows are kept open. If there's certain doors that can be opened, those doors are opened. In addition to that, musallis that are queuing to enter the masjid, particularly in circumstances where there's a physical register that has to be completed, must remain at least 1.5 meters apart from each other. They should also ideally be a one-way flow into the masjid and a separate flow out of the masjid to reduce crowding in enclosed places. Then there was a suggestion this morning in the community in which I live that why don't we arrange for the Jummahs to be performed at a particular sports ground. Unfortunately, this is not permitted at this stage in terms of the directions. While the regulations permit people to leave their homes to travel to places of worship, the definition of places of worship restrict the places to those usually used and recognized for religious purposes. So a sports ground wouldn't be such a place. But in addition to that, in terms of the regulations, sports grounds are closed to the public except for training of professional athletes and professional non-contact sports matches. I also think it's a good idea for the masjid committees to get people to agree to an indemnity and or exclusion of liability provision, and people need to understand that they're entering the masjid at their own risk, and they also need to take the necessary care. This is just important in order to try to ensure that you limit any liability if somebody in the congregation does contract COVID-19. I should, however, say to you that the indemnity or exclusion of liability provision is not the full answer to things, because in a scenario where somebody contracts COVID-19 and survives, you may be able to exclude liability, and you may be able to succeed in defending a claim by such a person because they agreed to an exclusion of liability and or an indemnity. But if such a person passes away and that musalli's dependents then pursue a loss of support claim, then you would not be protected by an exclusion of liability clause or an indemnity, because those dependents are not bound by that exclusion of liability provision. It may be that if the person's a wealthy person and he's got an estate worth something, that you can join the estate if there's an indemnity. But just understand that indemnities and exclusion of liability clauses are not foolproof. Then just also, I think it's important to emphasize to your musallis in each community that if law enforcement officials do come and visit the masjids during Salah times, let's not respond aggressively to them. Let's allow them to do their jobs. Let's remain calm, and let's interact with the law enforcement officials in a polite manner. With clients that have dealt with them in a polite manner and have remained calm, it's been easy for them to deal with it. But with clients that have become aggressive, the police in turn respond aggressively, and that just creates chaos. And doesn't facilitate could end up then in the sanctity of the Masaajid being affected, and we need to please bear that in mind. Then I just want to talk to you quickly about an organization called In Transformation Initiative. It's an organization that has been doing lots of work, lots of discussions between business, government, particularly the National Command Council, and through NGOs and other bodies. And they've invited us to provide them with information about any issues that particularly arise in any communities in relation to the masjids and complying with the directions. So if there are issues, please provide the details, including the nature of the issue, the masjid affected, and a key contact person's name, cell phone number, and email address, and that can be fed into this particular initiative and hopefully will find its way into the National Command Council. Over and above that, I want to advise the communities to please get the lawyers, medical professionals, and the alims to work together and to help our communities. If there are particular changes to the regulations or directions that can be suggested with input from the relevant ulama, supported by medical opinion, confirming that such changes will not increase the spread of the virus and may in fact assist in curbing the spread of the virus. This too should be passed on to the Jamiat, and if the lawyers also have clever ideas about specific wording for changes to the existing regulations and the directions, let's feed that through, and inshallah we can try to play a constructive role in facilitating proper worship by our communities. Then can I just end with this particular slide? I have been very disturbed by the divisions in our communities. I've been very disturbed by the name calling of some of our ulama. I just think this is completely unnecessary. There will be differences of opinion. There will be certain mosques that decide not to open. I don't think we must claim to suggest that that decision is wrong. Different communities have different circumstances, different resources, different infection levels, and we should leave it to the communities to make decisions from their own. And let's not start bad-mouthing communities or calling people munafiq or kafirs because particular decisions had been taken. It's time we started acting in a concerted fashion to make sure that we unite our communities and we stop focusing on our differences. In legal circles, I often disagree with my opponents or with colleagues about legal interpretation. That don't make those people my enemies. They, in a court matter, they would still be referred to as my learned friend. I think we need to, as a community, start inculcating that culture, that there will be different schools of thought, and unfortunately, that's just a factor of interpretation. But we need to be able to respect our differences and agree to disagree from time to time. May the Almighty guide us all, and I hope that all of you benefit from this presentation. Jazakallah. Uzair, can I hand over to you, Uzair?
I think it's Assalamu alaikum. I don't know if everyone can hear me. Is Maulana Suleiman Rawat, are you going to come on now?
Maulana Rawat, I think you still need to unmute yourself. You're still on mute, Maulana Rawat.
Can anyone hear me? Could I say a few words?
Alhamdulillah, Mullah, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
While are we waiting for Maulana Suleiman Rawat to get the technical details sorted out, I was supposed to say a few words in the beginning to welcome, but because of technical glitches, so we're still learning many of the things with regard to technology. And while it has been a great learning curve, let me just say a few things. I think it's an honor that we have been able to gather to discuss matters of common concern. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our gathering together one of barakah and blessings. I think it would be common cause that no one could have foresaw or could have predicted the implications and the results of COVID. Never mind many moons back, even if you were to ask someone or tell someone in late February up till early March that there's going to be a lockdown, there's not going to be international and domestic travel, and people will not be able to go for work, and Masaajid will be closed. People would have looked upon you as someone who is, you're not talking serious. It is something that is very far-fetched for it to happen. But of course, we know that this has happened. Now, as believers, we do know that everything is in the control of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing happens without the permission of Almighty Allah. Allah Ta'ala in the Quran says, وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. There is not a leaf that falls down from a tree, but Allah is aware of it, and it happens with the permission of Allah. وَإِن يَمْسَسْكَ اللَّهُ بِضُرٍّ. If any difficulty comes upon you, no one can remove it but Allah. وَإِن يَمْسَسْكَ اللَّهُ بِخَيْرٍ. If any good comes upon you, it is only with the will of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think these are situations that we have to, we need to be very clear with regard to this. That situations come from Almighty Allah. And Allah won't question us with regard to situations. Allah won't question us why these situations came upon you. Allah will question us with regard to our response to situation. So what we really need to do is, the situations will come, but what is important is, how do we respond to the situation? So Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, هَذَا مِنْ فَضْلِ رَبِّي. When any good conditions come upon you, Allah brings good condition and easy conditions upon you, لِيَبْلُوَنِي, to test whether you are grateful or ungrateful. When difficult or challenging conditions come upon you, Allah Ta'ala uses it to test whether you persevere or you become despondent. So when good comes, do you become arrogant or are you grateful? When challenges come, are you despondent or do you persevere? That is the challenge that is out from there. As believers, we need to be keeping this in mind. And let us all face it that when we started off this whole aspect of COVID-19 in South Africa or any other place in the world, it was uncharted territory. We relied upon experts. As Allah Ta'ala in the Holy Quran says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask people of expertise, ask people of remembrance if you do not know. So when we do get sick, who do we go to? We go to a doctor. We rely upon the doctor. There are so many juristic rulings where it is said, that you rely upon the view of a doctor in terms of reaching a juristic ruling. And as Aslam has made mention that, there's a need for us to start working in cooperation with one another. Alhamdulillah, the Jamiat has been able to work with IMA, with lawyers, etc. And we hope, inshallah, that this would even be greatly even more. Now, in terms of being uncharted territory, we've seen that there has been, different phases. So when the lockdown first came in level 5, at that time there was, general consensus that there must be a strict lockdown. People mustn't go out, and there are times when Jamiatul Ulama and many ulama throughout the world, we're not only looking at the South African situation, throughout the world, ulama, whether it be in Saudi Arabia, whether it be Makkah, Medina, Masjid, Aqsa, in different parts of the world, they took that decision with regard to the suspension of congregational prayers or keeping it just to the bare minimum in terms of few people to keep the Masjid Abad, or at least the Salah has been performed. But there was a suspension of major congregational prayers. That was the initial stages, and that was what was the expert view. Thereafter, we found that there has been a change from the experts in terms of allowing some form of interaction. As the experts' understanding of the pandemic evolves, you find now different perspectives moving from level 5 to level 3. And in this is not because that the transmission has lessened. It is because of the fact that you cannot keep a lockdown forever, and also allowing to return to some form of normality with measures that mitigate the potential of the spreading of the virus. And that is what, alhamdulillah, Aslam Bhai has made mention with regard to the regulation and with regard to the laws in terms of what were the protocols. Just bear in mind that when the United Ulama Council of South Africa took the route that we are going to approach government that as there is an easing of restriction in other fields, also to look at the easing of restrictions with regard to religious congregation, the government responded. And also bear in mind that it would have been very naive for us to think that the government is going to make a law only for Muslims, because the religious community and faith communities are by and large one. So it would have been naive to think that there was going to be a regulation that was only going to be upon Muslims. But I think in this particular way, there has been this whole particular form of now going back while taking into account a return with measures that mitigate the potential of the spread of the virus. And it's amazing. Up till 2 weeks ago, most of the people were clamoring for the opening of the Masjid. When it did come, we did realize that now many of the Masaajid, because of something hitting closer to home, and now people whom have become infected, some have passed on, Allah Ta'ala grant them the reward of a shaheed, and Allah Ta'ala elevate their status. Masajid have taken different viewpoints, and we need to respect that. I don't think we need to be in any way objecting to any of the Masajid. MJC have taken a position. There have been other Masajid that have taken positions. Some have taken position that will open with the protocols. Some have said that we will not be able to adhere to the protocols. Whichever has taken, let us respect that. And in conclusion, let me just say that we hope, inshallah, that this is not hope, inshallah, we are quite confident that it's a temporary phase. It will not be forever. And we just need to perhaps navigate this with love and respect. And inshallah, very soon there will be normality. We have also benefited there has been greater cooperation in different sectors of the community and society. We have come to, for example, know the benefits of Zoom meetings, which we never had before. Now we have Microsoft Teams meeting. But of course, these have been situations that have come upon us because of the circumstances. And we hope, inshallah, we will get back to normality as soon as possible with our du'as, with cooperation. And let us make dua that Nabi Karim had said that for every disease there is a cure. Allah has kept a cure for every disease. May Allah make it come sooner rather than later. And let me just conclude with this few words, and we will inshallah ask Dr. Uzair to continue with the meeting.
Jazakumullah for that, Mana. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me now. We seem to have had a technical glitch. The system was just unmuting me all the time. We did a test earlier on. It worked. Then I don't know what happened, but now I think we can. We're good to go. I think we also just want to acknowledge at this stage all the participants, the various imams, the various committee members. This program is being broadcast live on Radio Islam, as well as on CII, and then it's also being live streamed on Souk Islam. So we had the first presentation there by Attorney Aslam Musaji. I've noted some of the questions that have come through. We'll take those questions towards the end of the program, inshallah. We're now going to go to Dr. Uzair Muhammad. He is with the Islamic Medical Association, and he'll be addressing us for the next 15 minutes or so, inshallah, on the medical perspective. Dr. Uzair.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm going to try and share my slides now. In the next. Okay, can my slides be seen? Okay.
Not yet, Uzair.
Not yet, no.
Okay, let me just try again. It's a technical problem. 1 second, I'll sort it out.
Nazim can put the slides up for you, Dr. Uzair. So maybe you can comment.
That might be better,
Nazim will
yes.
put up the slides from his side. Okay.
That's
Bismillah.
fine.
Here we go. The slides are on.
So this is the Aslam Musaji slides. Okay, this one is fine, yeah. Okay, you can
Bismillah.
make the screen to slide presentation, please. Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Uzair Muhammad. I'm a public health medicine specialist that works out of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I've been fortunate enough to be part of this team from the Islamic Medical Association that work tirelessly to come up with these guidelines or guidance that we provided to both to the Jamiatul Ulama and to the people of South Africa. And this team has been led by Dr. Yaqub Ishaq and Dr. Shoaib Wadi, who provided us overall input. And we had members from throughout South Africa. So we had doctors from Cape Town, from Johannesburg, and from KwaZulu-Natal, all coming together to ensure that we come up with something that will be scientifically sound as well as accepted among the community. If we can move on to the slides, I'm not sure. Can we move on to the next few slides, please? Okay, so my presentation was to look at two aspects. One was to look at what are the specific regulations and how they affect us directly, and I'm not going to go down that road because I think Aslam Musaji has adequately covered most of them. The second aspect of what I was going to look at has also in the main has been covered. So I will not take the 15 minutes that's been allocated, but left to say that when the Islamic Medical Association and the team sat together, our objective was not about compliance, because compliance is the least of our issues or the least of our problem. When we look at things as medical professionals, it's about the protection, prevention, and the restoration of health. So, how we could go and save lives and reduce risk rather than looking at measures that, you know what, we will tick the box and ensure that uh, we in line with regulations, because that should not be our focus. And as has been adequately mentioned by Aslam Musaji, that we have so many issues and so many uh, incidences of how the coronavirus has spread within congregational settings. So the one thing that we all must be very clear about is that despite the best recommendations and the most stringent measures, there is unfortunately no guarantee that we will be able to prevent the spread of coronavirus in our masajid, to our congregants, and in our community. So that's the one thing that we should be very clear about. Secondly, is that the risk of acquiring the virus is higher in closed environments. So where we tend to congregate and where we tend to work to move to be in close contact with each other, despite that the fact that we might be using the preventative measures, the likelihood that we will be spreading the virus among ourselves is great. And the situation that we find ourselves in might be more detrimental if the procedures are not followed. So, therefore, the underlying principle of the guidance that the Islamic Medical Association provided was that we are not in a position to say that everyone should rush to open the masajid immediately. Each masjid should consider its structural and environmental conditions. It needs to look at the social circumstances of the community, what the disease burden is at the specific moment in time, and what the disease trajectory is, and the ability of the masjid to comply with the minimal criteria for infection prevention and control. So once you have all that in place, and then you under the guide, you have that sorted, and you want to then open your masajid. The first step that's been adequately covered by by Aslam Musaji is regarding the planning and preparation. So I'm not going to delve on that slide, but he's covered it, is that you need a coordinating committee made up of different members that need to look at how the flow will be within the masajid and what will happen in the masjid. Those details are all available in our guidance. When we talk about Salah, from our perspective, we try to put forward adequate explanations as to what should be done. So we've given guidance in that we're advising that the contact in the masjid should be the least possible time. So if we can get our congregations out between the adhan and the jamaat, there should be 10 or 15 minutes, and salah should be shortened. And people, when we were in school, we all were in assembly and we had lines, and each class will be dismissed at a different time. So we're advocating that each saf in the masjid be dismissed within minute intervals, so that we don't get this congregation immediately in the foyer of the masjid, so which allows flexible movement of people. The other suggestion that we put forward was dependent on how masjid will work. See, the one thing that we all need to be aware of, and with the disease and the epidemic and trajectory of the burden of disease going up exponentially, and we know that in all other areas except Cape Town, we nowhere near our peak, and we can have, then if we adequately allocate space within our masjid, and we have numbered musallas where people, when they're entering, have been given a certain number that they actually go to. In the time, if Allah forbid, if one of the musallis then turns out to be positive, we will have evidence of who the close contacts are. And we will be able to identify those people immediately. So instead of having a situation where we're standing shoulder to shoulder and everyone in the masjid then becomes a contact, then we will have to close the masjid down, because no one in that 50 will then be able to come to the masjid, because every single one of them will be a contact and that will need to be quarantined for 14 days. So if we adequately space ourselves and we have allocated spaces, then we will be able to do a risk assessment and find out who the nearest contact will be. That's the one situation that I like to touch on. And the second thing is with regard to the sanitation of hands. So the Department of Health guidance says that it should be 70% alcohol-based solution. So if you have to look at the Center for Disease Control guidance, it says that when the composition of the sanitizer is 60% ethanol or 70% isopropanol, which are different makes of alcohol, that's the variation, and depending on what the sanitizer has, it will either be 60% or 70%. The second thing is adequately washing hands with soap and water for 20 seconds is also a very good preventative measure. But if you have to look at what will happen in our Masajid, when people come in and if you have to leave the taps open, everyone will be touching the same tap, and people will then be washing their hands and closing the tap. And the likelihood that people will then spread it among themselves is greater. So that's the reason that for specifically in areas of high concentration and high congregation, we advocated that we use a sanitizer rather than soap and water. And the issue of the wudu khanas and the toilets is only for the reason that we advocated you leave emergency ones open rather than having it open for everyone, is that again, the places of congregation have increased the number of viruses that will be spreading, and people are at greater risk. And because what will happen in the wudu khana, people's masks will be down and people will then talk to each other, and what will then happen is that we will create an environment where there will be spread of the disease. The next thing that we need to look at, and I think we all need to ponder very carefully, is that in most masjids at this present moment in time, people might only look at the temperature. And we have to look, even if we look at shopping centers and we have to look at different environment, is the person taking the temperature? Is the machine adequately calibrated? Is the person taking the temperature adequately trained to even identify what's a high temperature or a low temperature? And remember that temperature is not the first symptom. So that's why if you have to look carefully within the guideline, within the regulations, and one of the questions that was raised, section 4.2a says specifically that on entrance to any place, people need to be screened, and it's the responsibility of the committee or the imam of the masjid to make sure that people are screened. So many people have explored the opportunity of using apps for this purpose. There are lots of apps that are available, but the problem with these apps is not developing the app. The app is freely available, but the hosting rights of the app become a major challenge, because people are now talking about 250 rand per person per month or 10 rand per person. So the cost over a period of time will be exorbitant. So the type of screening that needs to be done has been piloted in many massages, and we also have Google Forms that have been developed for this purpose that should be made freely available to the masjid, and as long as they have people that will be able to take responsibility for it. So I'm not going to go through the other aspects because it's all been covered by Aslam Musaji. I think he's been very well trained by somebody from the medical professional. But the last thing that I need to emphasize is that it's important that the ulama, the medical professionals, and lawyers work together, because when there is an outbreak in the masjid, what are the next steps that need to be followed? Who's going to take responsibility, or all of us are going to die for cover? Or we're going to disown the person, we'll say that the person never came from our masjid, and we're going to hide this under the carpet, and we're going to move forward and just continue with our congregations together. Remember, disinfection and cleaning of the masjid is compulsory, and we have to do that. For now, we're saying if you have plastic covering, or if you're using disposable covers over the carpet, and each musalli is bringing their own musalla, then we can clean the area twice a day. And it's important that we use the relevant detergents that have been advocated. So we should move forward in that direction. And if there is a case in our masjid then we're actually going to need to do deep cleaning and cleaning of all contact points before we can allow people to come back to our masjid. So I think the one advice that I normally give my friends and I tell everyone, the way that we, the Muslim community, seems to be treating coronavirus is with the same stigma that we associated with HIV and AIDS. Because we want to hide it under the carpet, we don't want people to know what happened, and in that way we're actually spreading the virus. So it's important that we understand there is no stigma associated with acquiring this. You didn't go out there some way to get it. It came to you, and Allah knows best why it came to you. So it's important that we understand this, and the obligation upon us to notify the government, to notify the district Center for Disease Control Coordinator is important, because we need to track and trace all cases. The only way that we're going to combat coronavirus is by finding all cases and their contacts and quarantining or self-isolating them. By letting people roam around in the community, we're actually going to spread this disease more. So I think these are important considerations that we as a ummah need to take and move forward with. The fiqh of what's been mentioned and everything else is for the ulama to sort out. But when we look at everything that come out, they say that you need to take the opinion of a medical practitioner that you trust and that you go to. For our diabetes, for our kidney problems, then when it comes to fasting during Ramadan, we take the opinion of medical practitioners. Now, when the medical fraternity is advising that we maintain social distance, then it becomes a challenge, because then we want to look at what the Masaajid and the Masla are telling us. So I think these are important considerations, inshallah. We make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us all guidance and protect us all, inshallah.
I mean, Jazakumullah, Dr. Uzair, for that very comprehensive presentation, and also for the pertinent points that you raised. We do apologize for those who are not able to see some of the slides. All of this is new to us, and we have a technical team working behind the scenes, but even they grappling with one or two issues, so we apologize for that. Nonetheless, in the spirit of making up for some time, I am noting the questions as we're going along. We're going to move right on to the next presentation, and that is going to be delivered by the head Mufti of Jamiatul Ulama South Africa, that is Mufti Zakaria Pando Sahab, and Mufti Sahab will be explaining to us some of the relevant masail pertaining to the issue at hand. Mufti Sahab.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam. We can hear you, Mufti Sahab. We can continue.
Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa amma ba'd. قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وقال تعالى أيضا وفوق كل ذي علم عليم صدق الله العظيم. Firstly, we have to be very grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has permitted us to acquire knowledge from different avenues, and especially He has allowed us to acquire our knowledge from the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasul Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and thereafter from the statements and opinions of the Fuqaha Kiram. Having said that, we also have to be grateful to the participants who have taken out the time to come and listen to this important program and understand the matters of Sharia and the underlying issues that we are faced with. We should acknowledge from the beginning that we are basically facing an unprecedented and extraordinary situation, not only from the perspective of the Muslims, but even the non-Muslims, whether it's local or international. The entire world, the entire globe is basically gripped with the matter of COVID-19. It does not mean that in the past there was no pandemics, epidemics, etc. There was much more than this as well. However, Allah knows best what is the situation from now moving forward, how large and how extraordinary the situation will turn out to be. Firstly, we need to understand that this matter of COVID-19 or the coronavirus is a reality. And the importance of this is dependent on the information that we have received. So we find that by and large, the information that comes forth from the medical fraternity is that this is a reality and it is large scale and it is a pandemic and it has transcended beyond boundaries and not only affecting certain countries. So this is a reality, and in terms of its consequences, it is quite significant that it leads, apart from a person becoming seriously ill, in terms seriously ill, it also leads to death and fatalities. I mean, a while ago, it was very difficult for us to comprehend the concept of fatalities as a consequence of the COVID-19. But now, as we are realizing people are passing away in our societies, in our communities, people who are close to us and family members, now the reality is hitting home. But before this, we were having information from the various media outlets of what was happening in the other countries, the UK, what's happening in America, what's happening in South Korea, what's happening in China, Italy, etc. But now when it comes directly at our doorstep, the reality actually hits us now. And Allah knows best what is the situation moving forward. So from a medical perspective, this is considered as a reality. And it is something that we need to work towards. And so from the medical fraternity, they have provided they first of all have accepted this as a reality. Number two, what is the solution, or what are the solutions recommended by the medical fraternity? The medical fraternity have provided this. And because it has become a large-scale pandemic and it has its potential of reaching every person or most of the people in the country, to find that the government steps in and basically it decides to listen to the medical fraternity, take opinion from them, and eventually implement those kind of solutions from the medical fraternity. So we have basically two angles now. One angle is the angle of medical fraternity providing guidance, providing the solutions in this matter, and the second angle is the angle of the government that will ensure that this takes place collectively and on a national scale. So from those two angles, we find as a Muslim, we find that we are basically constrained to take this kind of solutions from the medical fraternity, and more so from a Muslim point of view, if the medical fraternity comprises of Muslim practitioners and specialists in this field, and they are providing these kind of solutions. So we find that we are basically directed from the medical fraternity as well as the implementation of government. Having said this, we find that some of the solutions that have been provided from the medical fraternity, which the government is basically implementing and insisting that we implement as well for our own common goodness, is number one, social distancing, number two, adequate sanitizing, hand washing and hygiene, personal hygiene, number three, masking, wearing masks, etc. in public spaces, and four, they are much more than this, and number four, isolation in the form of lockdowns, where we have different lockdowns, level 5, 4, 3, 2, etc., and where we have this quarantining, etc., taking place. And this also led to limitation of congregations, etc., and congregating of people in different areas, not necessarily only confined to places of worship, but across the board. That's why it was implemented in terms of places of work as well, and across all sectors, in other words. So you find that these are the solutions that have actually been provided by the medical fraternity. And this is what government have taken on and basically implemented and requesting, or in fact, demanding that we actually implement this for the common goodness of the society. So this is something that is the reality. The question now we are at is, what is the Sharia position in terms of this? Where do we fit in? Especially knowing well that some of these solutions lead to a violation of certain Sharia principles or certain Sharia positions. So, for example, we find that the issue of lockdown or limitation of congregations, or, for example, the aspect of social distancing, etc., leads to a violation or confrontation of certain Sharia rules, and especially in matters of prayer and worship, matters of Salah. So, for example, it impacts us in terms of performing Salah in the Masjid. It has impacted us in performing Salah in the form of congregation. It impacts us in terms of utilizing sanitation, sanitizing using, for example, herbal formulas. It is impacted in terms of the elderly or immunocompromised people from attending the gatherings, and especially masjid, praying in masjids. It has impacted in terms of distancing amongst ourselves in terms of congregational prayer. It has impacted us in terms of wearing masks. So you find that these kind of solutions that have been provided by the medical fraternity had a consequence from a Sharia point of view. Now the question arises, what do we do in a situation like this? On the one hand, we have the Sharia law. On the other hand, there is a demand from, or a request from a prescription from medical fraternity. And that prescription is such that it violates or confronts the principles of Sharia or the laws or the rules of Sharia. What do we do in cases like this? The answer is very clear. All of us in our lives, somewhere along the line, over the years, we find that the law is there, but because of certain extra circumstance, a certain necessity, we have to basically move away from the rule and we have to accept and welcome the concession. So this is a principle in Sharia which all of us practice in various parts of our lives. So for example, the Quran allows for this. For a Salah, if a Zohar is 4 rakat Salah, but if a person is a traveler, then Sharia, because of the difficulties of travel, Sharia provides a concession to this. So a person reads 2 rakat Salah. Or for example, in a case of a person, a lady who is fasting in the month of Ramadan, because for example she is pregnant, in this case, and her pregnancy is such, she's advanced and she cannot fast. It's so difficult for her to fast. Whereas the result of this, we find that the Sharia allows a lady like this that she should not be fasting and she may qada for Ramadan. Or for example, a person who is in a situation where he has, for example, an eye surgery, eye operation, as the result of which you find a person like this, if you make him sajda, it becomes difficult. The doctor tells him that to make sajda can be very harmful for him. So in this case here, the doctor, for something that might happen to him, the doctor tells him he's not doing this. Out of our experience in the field, we tell you this is going to be harmful to you. So to undo the surgery, to make the situation even worse. So in this case here, we know that Sharia allows for this, that He allows for us not to make sajda on the ground, putting our forehead on the ground. In fact, it allows us to make sajda by gesture. So like this, there are many, many examples in life that all of us have practiced on concessions. And the rule of the Sharia is there in place. And however, the matter comes in terms of concession. So the issue with us here is that why it has become such a matter of uproar, of disagreement so much amongst our society, of confusion amongst ourselves. For various reasons. And one of the reasons is because it has been on a large scale, this matter, and which demands a large scale concession. So normally the concession was for individuals or a small group of people, but in this case it's a large group of people, the entire country, for example, or many countries together. And basically, because this is something unprecedented, we find it very difficult to accept this kind of a concession. So this is a matter of a psychological aspect of it, and a more an emotional matter of it. But in principle, the issue is that Sharia, the rule of the Sharia should be upheld and respected. And however, if there is a situation that demands concession, then in that case, the concession will be permitted. So in this case here, who will do this? Who will provide the prescription for concession in this matter? So the Sharia, the rules of Sharia have provided this. Within Sharia itself, it's the rules that regulate the concession. And especially those who study the field of Islam and Fatwa basically are trained in this particular field and area, where there are a lot of masail have been collated, their books have been written in this matter, where we move away from the preferred position. The preferred position in terms of the madhab, for example, or for example, what's in the Quran and Hadith, for example, to move away from there. So who will do this? Basically, it is the scholars that have been trained in this field. They are the muftis in this area. So the rationale is that this concession is provided by the Sharia. It's a matter of, because such large scale, it becomes difficult for us to accept this. Number two, the other reason for the confusion, difficulty to accept this, or you find disagreements among scholars, is because generally you find everybody together cannot always agree on everything. You find differences of opinion do come about. Similarly, here we find there's difference of opinion in terms of interpretation of and application of when the concession should be applied. So does the situation demand a concession or not? And which situation we can apply the concession, which situation can we not? And up to which level can we apply the situation, and which level we will not apply the concession? So because of this, because it's a large-scale matter, we find that there are different scholars in the field, and it ends up where we find we have different opinion. And the way we handle this is that normally opinion, and whatever the position is of the scholars that we are following, we basically follow that position, and we respect other views as well. So because no scholar is in a position where he's doing changes, concession purely for his own sake, of a fame, of a body, of a power, of a wealth. It's purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is in emulation and fulfilling the injunction of Quran and Hadith, Sunnah of Rasul Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So the Quran and Sunnah allows for concessions, but it's just a matter of how we apply it, when we apply it, which level we apply it. We are going to find this kind of disagreements. And so disagreements have always been the case in our Islamic history. In fact, it's not only an Islamic matter. Disagreements is across all sectors of human life, whether it's in the medical fraternity, legal fraternity, political landscape, wherever the case may be. We find disagreements are always part and parcel of society. But the important thing is how do we manage these kind of differences that is very important. So the first thing in this matter is that we basically consider that the ulama who are providing positions of concession are not doing this for any ulterior motive. We should have trust in the ulama, and they have put an accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. Just like how we feel we are accountable to Allah, every scholar is accountable. In fact, more so in terms of the hadith, more so accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his knowledge, and the way he applies his knowledge and the way he practices upon his knowledge. Having said that, we should trust every alim for his position. And if there is a disagreement and we do not follow that position, we follow another scholar, another body of ulama, then in this case here, the other side should respect them for what they are saying and do not take their dignity away and use derogatory terms, etc. Coming to the point itself now, that this kind of medical recommendations that have come from the medical fraternity, which basically is implemented from the side of the government now, it has an impact on certain areas of our Islamic aspect. Although it has an impact on many other aspects, like economic aspects as well, but we will focus more on the worship area of it, and predominantly on the area of our Salah in congregation and in Masajid. So we find that firstly, the position in here is that our Salah should be read in Masajid, and it should be done in congregation. This is the prophetic practice and the practice of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. And this is something which has passed down generation to generation, which we need to preserve and will have to preserve it till the day of Qiyamah, inshallah. That Salah has to be performed in a masjid in congregation. And this is the requirement of Sharia. There are many hadith that mentions the importance of it also, and also mentions the warnings against violating this rule. However, because of the prescription of the medical fraternity, and you find that it requires, for example, limitation of gatherings, or for example, it requires that we should distance ourselves for the duration of the epidemic. So in this moment, what do we do? So in this case here, we find that the matter of Salah in the masjid is impacted, the aspect of Salah in congregation is impacted, the aspect of sanitizing, because it requires that we sanitize our hands, etc. And the recommendation is to have a 70% alcohol content in it, or an alternative, which we will discuss a little just now, inshallah. And for example, it requires that the elderly should not be isolated, and they should not come into contact with the general people, because they are most the people who are most susceptible to the virus, and also the immunocompromised. They should not come into the masjids, for example. Or for example, the distancing in congregation is impacting that area, especially the aspects of mask. So I will just briefly go through. I'm not going to go into much detail because we don't have much time left. So as far as the aspect of Salah and Masajid are concerned, we find that initially the recommendation on medical ground from the Jamiatul Ulama was that we limit our congregation in Masajid, because if it starts spreading from there, then you find that it affects many more people in our society. And there are some reports that where in certain other countries where the Muslims congregated, and when they moved out from there, it created more problems and more people got exposed to the virus. So we felt that at that point that we need to limit the congregations and to limit, because this will lead to limit the spreading of the virus itself. And alhamdulillah, by and large, you find that it worked with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Jamiat has basically taken that approach, and that was eventually then implemented by the government that we should not be actually congregating at all. You find subsequently the other institutions have come in, ulama, etc., and they have allowed for this. So when the other ulama have allowed for this, it was actually allowed on either one of two bases. Either they have allowed for the suspension of congregations, especially large congregations in the Masaajid, go on a medical grounds, or because it was the directive of the government, directive of the state. So this was a concession, irrespective of whether the concession was because of medical ground or because of the enforcement of law. But this is a concession, and a concession like this is recognized in terms of the Sharia. However, you find that the situation has changed from level 5 to 4 to 3 now. So you find the situation is fluid, and you find that now there's some leeway in this. So naturally, you find that we are allowed to go and congregate again. When we are allowed to congregate, the medical fraternity still insists and still mentioned out of their training and the experience and knowledge and expertise in the field that we have to be very careful when we go back into our masajid. So as a result of which, we find that if we cannot manage the recongregation of musallis, then we should be very careful of just rushing into that. And you find as a result of which some masajid have taken still a cautious view of not opening in masajid or still suspending the congregation in masajid because they feel they're not ready for this. In fact, the spread is too much in our society, the infection rate is very high, and it's leading to the fatalities of many more people in society. So we respect that position as well. And then you find some of the other opinions saying that it was opening completely. Reopening completely, we should understand that we're not going to put some measures in place in terms of our protection. It will open up another bout of infection among society, which our medical fraternity considers as a second wave. And as a result, it's fine. It will become the means from the apparent way cause of effect. We find that it will become the means of spreading this. However, in reality, it is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that decides this matter. But we are in terms of Sharia, we are instructed to make use of means in this world and make an effort in this world. The deed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a separate matter altogether, and we do not know what Allah has decided in this matter. But nevertheless, we are instructed to make use of means and make use of knowledge that we have in this world. And on the basis of that, we find we can regulate ourselves. So you find that basically the opening and the masajid has now taken place, but not all everywhere. Some masajid have still not opened, or some have opened, but they have not basically allowed for congregational prayer. What they have allowed for is individual prayer. Whoever comes in can read individual prayer and move out. Then you find the other masajid have allowed for congregational prayer, but because of the restrictions, 50 people and less, you find that they allow for that. And if it's not possible to cater for all the musallis, because 50 is too little, then we move on to a rotational system if it's possible. If that's not possible, then we can still read our salahs in other venues. And we can still read our salahs like what we were doing in the past, in our homes, for example, or in our workplaces, etc. The idea is to read in the masjid. But because of this circumstance, we find that the concession will still apply in the current circumstance as well. As far as the aspect of sanitization is concerned, now because the regulation requires that we need to have the sanitizers that include alcohol or ethanol for that matter, 70% of it. Now in this case here, I see that Abdul Musaji has mentioned that there is an alternative, probably the government does recognize, is for the medical fraternity maybe to inspect and investigate this matter and give us more direction. Nevertheless, as far as sanitizers are concerned, it will be allowed to use, we are allowed to use sanitizers. However, as far as the alcohol content is concerned, there's disagreement among the scholars. We find that some scholars are of the opinion that we should think from alcohol, because alcohol, like every other alcohol, like wine, etc., is prohibited. This also should be prohibited. On the other hand, other scholars have allowed for it. So therefore, you find that if those scholars are allowing, we should respect the view, because this is a matter of an unprecedented circumstance. And you find that alcohol content sanitizers actually are more for means of basically, cleansing our hands and removing the virus, etc., as much as we can. So this has come from the medical fraternity. Yes, we do understand there's the debate amongst the people whether this is 100% workable or not. But every matter has got a disagreement and difference of opinion. But we need to take on a position And the position, by and large, from medical fraternity is this. So basically, we'll follow this kind of recommendation. And in these kind of matters, we have 100 consultants, medical fraternity, continuously the IMA, and various other doctors as well. As far as the elderly are concerned and immunocompromised personnel people are concerned, our recommendation to them also is that stay at home. Because you find that you don't put yourself in a situation where you cause harm to ourselves. So, in terms of the hadith, you find in the life of Umar radiallahu anhu, there was a case of a lady who had leprosy, and she wanted to come to the Masjid. Umar radiallahu anhu instructed her to read her Salah at home. So there were cases where you find that if it leads to certain problems, then people are allowed, people can be stopped from coming to the Masjid. In this case here, it's our own sake, of our own health, protection, that we stay at home, we read our Salah at home, and perform our Salah in congregation at home. Inshallah, we'll get the same sawab, reading Salah in the Masjid as well. But our intention actually was to perform Salah in the Masjid. We have been doing that all along. By staying at home now, because of this, it's not on our own side, from our own side, it's not inside, there's something because of circumstances beyond our control. So inshallah, by practicing on this, we hopefully we hope Allah will give us the support. As far as the aspect of distancing in Salah congregation is concerned, the same principle applies here. This, we should understand that for distancing in Salah is as long as it takes place in the Masjid vicinity, in a proper Sharia Masjid, you find that distancing amongst yourself will not break the Salah. Number two, it will not also nullify the following of the muqtadi with the Imam. Because there are many case studies like this in the books of fiqh. There are many case examples like this, and the Masaajid is quite a big of fiqh, that if there are gaps between people, although the ideal is that we have namaz next to each other, the requirement of Sharia is that we stand next to each other. There are many hadiths regarding this matter, and one is against it as well. So the principle is that we have to stand next to each other and not leave gap whatsoever. However, the situation is now different. This is the situation that warrants a concession. And like many other matters, we have applied concessions. We will apply the concession. And the concession will be such that we stay apart from each other 1.5 meter away, for example. In terms of the books of fiqh, if a person stays away from another, or there's a separation between the Imam and the Muqtadi, for example, of a distance of 1-2 meters, whatever the case may be, even in the Masjid, or between the Muqtadis themselves, in this case, this will not nullify the Salah, it will not even nullify the following of the Muqtadi of the Imam, as long as they're in one vicinity. Similarly, if the Masjid, that the spacing of the Muqtadis basically have to go out of the Masjid itself and go into the courtyard and extend the courtyard, all of that will be considered one congregation, and this would be acceptable. Because the rule is, as long as it's considered one area, and number two, as long as we know the movements of the Imam, by hearing his voice or by seeing his actions, or the Muqtadis behind him, the followers see their positions who are actually following the Imam. So as long as we understand the position of the Imam and we're able to follow him, we find that kind of a congregation to be acceptable. So although this is not the ideal situation, the ideal is to read Salah together next to each other. However, this situation is an extraordinary situation that requires a concession, and on the basis of medical prescription, we find that this recommendation, this concession has been allowed by the ulama. So in Sharia, we should understand one more thing, is that in Sharia matters, that the position only of a Muslim doctor and Muslim specialist basically will be admitted, and that basically will be used to basically allow for these kind of concessions. And in this case here, we find there are many scholars, many of medical Muslims, and they are also advising us in this particular manner. Basically, Jamiat has taken the position listening to the Muslim medical specialists and provided these kind of guidelines. Inshallah, we will coordinate on this area, on this matter. We have provided about 12 or 16 guidelines to our social media platform, and more details of these matters on our website. Inshallah, we should look at that and implement that. Hopefully, inshallah, this will basically resolve any questions with regard to this matter. The last and parting point from my side would be that we should respect the differences of opinion amongst ourselves, especially amongst scholars. I think we should not be believing and make ourselves believe that another scholar is doing this not for the sake of Allah Ta'ala, or he's doing this for fear, or he's doing it for favor, or he's doing it for money, or whatever the case may be. Every scholar is accountable to Allah. We have accountability in our hearts to Allah Ta'ala, and it is on the basis of the Sharia requirement that we provide concession, because concession is a Sharia prescription in itself as well. This is proven in the Quran, it's proven in the Hadith as well. So just like the rule of law is a Sharia matter, concession in Sharia is also a prescription of Sharia. So whether we're following the rule or whether we're following a concession, we're actually still following the Sharia in all cases. And inshallah, we'll end on this matter. Hopefully, it will be beneficial for all of us.
We'll say Jazakumullah to Mufti Zakaria Pandosap, some important clarifications there. And I think I'll take this opportunity to ask all the ulama and the imams who are on this webinar or who are listening on the radio or watching on the live stream, as well as the committee members, that if you require any clarification, if you want to understand the issues further from a fiqhi perspective, then by all means contact the Jamiatul Ulama officers in that regard. It is getting a bit late. We just have one more item on the agenda before we take a few quick questions, and that is not related to the masjid issue, but recently we know we had the issue of moon sighting, and there were some questions that came to the fore as a result of how things unfolded. So we've got Mufti Muhammad Minty, who's the Deputy Secretary General of Jamiatul Ulama South Africa, and he's also part of the Hilal Committee for UXA, the United Ulama Council of South Africa. And Mufti Sahib will give us a brief talk on some key aspects pertaining to moon sighting. Mufti Sahib.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. I know it's quite late now and I'm not sure of the relevance of the discussion. The biryani of Eid, I'm sure, is already digested. But nevertheless, I've been asked to just say a few words with respect to the issue of the moon for Shawwal, that is for Eid this year. So just to put matters into context, the UXA has a Hilal committee that is functional for 12 months of the Islamic year, and we consult monthly on the night of sighting. So in terms of this, the sighting for Shawwal, on the eve of Shawwal, we'd like to draw your attention to the fact that not only was the sighting, there was a sighting that was reported in Brits and that which went viral on the social media platforms, which then caused much confusion amongst the masses in the ummah. But nevertheless, so just to put things into context, we received, as UXA, reported sightings early on in the evening from areas in KwaZulu-Natal, from, if I recall correctly, from an area in Westville, and then another recorded sighting in Den Hauser. And the responsible members of the Hilal Committee of Natal had investigated those sightings, and it found them not to be credible. Now, when we say a sighting is not credible, we are not meaning and inferring in any way that the persons that have reported the sighting are not credible, or that they have fabricated intentionally, fabricated a sighting. It is just that what they reported, it appears to them to be a crescent or a moon, but in reality it's something else. And there are various criteria that the United Ulama Council of South Africa used to determine that. For example, we'll ask people that sight the moon, the shape of the moon, the location of the moon, the time of sighting, which horizon was the moon sighted, etc. It's also important to understand at this point that determining the beginning of an Islamic month or the end of an Islamic month is the function in Islamic state of a qadi. It's not the function of any person. So even an alim or a mufti who resides in Islamic state by himself, or even any pious person, cannot decide whether he's going to start to end an Islamic month. It is the function of the Amirul Mu'mineen or his deputed qadi. In the absence of that, there has to be a reliable and working Hilal committee that is accepted by the general Muslim masses of the community. So nevertheless, there are certain important judicial functions that these Hilal committees conduct and carry out on the evening. And in doing so, the committees of KwaZulu-Natal had concluded that the sightings that were reported were not were inconclusive, and therefore we could not determine the Eid sighting based on that. We thereafter received a sighting from an individual in Bloemfontein, and the criteria for the Eid moon on a clear horizon is that such a large number of people must sight the moon in that location, the particular location, that it leaves no doubt that the moon was seen. In other words, it is impossible for a person to consider that the witnesses or the people that have observed the moon have collaborated and on a fabricated sighting. Unfortunately, it was only this individual, a professional medical doctor, and his spouse, his wife, who had seen the moon. And our investigation, contacting different people in the area of Bloemfontein, resulted that these were the only two people that had seen the moon on a clear horizon, and therefore it was not conclusive. This information and discussion had taken place with the person involved in it. He was explained that on the basis of this, his evidence or his sighting cannot be used as a criteria of determining Eid. Thereafter, we received a news of a sighting in Brits. And once we received the sighting, there was an alim on hand who went to the particular family and consulted the family and informed us that there is a family that has observed or sighted the moon or claimed to have sighted the moon in Brits. We then, as per our normal procedure and practice, sent out our standard Shahada form with the relevant questions that had to be asked to these individuals. Before the form had even reached the alim, he started asking the individuals what they had seen. The individuals were not willing to give any further information. They said they had seen something that seemed like a moon, but in terms of the shape of the crescent, what angle was it at, and a number of basic questions that I usually ask, they said that it's up to the Jamiatul Ulama South Africa to determine whether what they had seen was a crescent or whether it was some other object on the horizon, and they were not willing to give any further details because they themselves were not sure and certain of what they had seen. As a result of which, the alim who had consulted them and spoken to them informed the Jamiat that he does not have any confidence in the sighting that they had actually seen the moon. It is perhaps that they had seen something else, and we cannot consider this as a sighting. On the basis of this information, all of these sightings were relayed to UCSA and all the members of UCSA with a special teleconference that was called on the evening, and as a result of which UCSA had then taken a decision. Some time later, after the UCSA decision, we then received calls of one or two other ulama that had seen the moon in Brits. So the question we had is that firstly, the moon set on that evening was around 6:10. We received a call more than 1 hour later from that alim who claimed that he and another alim had sighted the moon. Whereas one of the members of our Hilal committee at the office in Johannesburg had consulted the second alim who had seen the sighting earlier in the evening and asked him whether him or anyone in Brits had seen the moon, and he completely said that did he see the moon, nor does he have any knowledge of anyone seeing the moon. And as a result of which, the sightings could not be conclusive. One important thing to understand, it was a clear horizon. There were many other people in Brits that went out to see the moon who had not seen the moon. And there was no certainty in the people that had reported the sighting. And then there was also a possibility of witnesses collaborating among themselves from moonset, which was at 6:10 to way after 7 o'clock, somewhere around 7:30, 7:45, when the news started going out viral on social media. So there are a number of factors that did not give us any certainty or any safety and surety that there was a sighting or a sighting by which we could determine Eid. It's also important to understand that if we were to call Eid wasn't on the day, then there was much noise in the community that why are we not allowing people to celebrate Eid? But the question also needs to be asked that what if it was still Ramadan and people did not keep one important fast of Ramadan? But nevertheless, all the sightings were inconclusive, as a result of which we could not confirm Eid on that evening, which was on Saturday night, and it could not be held on Sunday. This was accepted by all the members of UCSA. And in fact, even the alim who had reported the sighting from Brits had had the confidence of the members who had reported the sighting to him that they were inconclusive, they were uncertain, and they had prayed Taraweeh Salah with him on the evening and continued fasting on the next day. So there was no issue from them. It's just that the social media made a greater hype of it than that what the reality was. Just one last issue I'd like to raise and discuss is the issue related to the sighting of Mozambique. The question was asked, why do we not accept the sighting of Mozambique? So there's been much effort that was made in recent years in terms of having working relationships with members of our neighboring countries. However, the difficulty we have is that there are a number of Muslim formations, organizations, ulama bodies within South Africa that are not willing to accept the neighboring sightings for a number of reasons. There's no time to go into those details. And the dilemma that UCSA faces is that are we going to accept the sightings of neighboring countries and then have a huge disunity and conflict within our Muslim community as we had perhaps 20 odd years ago in this country? Or do we maintain the unity in South Africa even though we don't accept the neighboring countries? And that's a position that UCSA currently holds based on not only the ulama formations within UCSA, but even outside of UCSA, who are not willing to accept, for a number of reasons and valid reasons, the sightings of neighboring countries. So this is just very briefly just a report on the sighting of Shawwal of this year. Anyone wants any further details, they can contact us at the Jamiat and we'll give them further details, inshallah.
Jazakumullah Mufti Minty Saab. We almost out of time. We had said we will conclude by 10 o'clock. So I'm just going to ask a few questions to Aslam Musaji and then to Dr. Uzair before we terminate, inshallah. Aslam, can you come back on, please?
Jimran, I'm back on. Jazakallah.
Okay, somebody wanted clarification that, that 30-minute gap between services, as the regulations refer to it, is it for a short prayer like we have our Salah, or is it for the lengthy 2 hours, 2.5 hour service that the Christians, for example, would have? So if we have, say, a Isha Salah, which will take 15 minutes max, do you still need to have a half an hour gap before you can have a second Isha Jamaat?
Monana, the way I read that direction, there's two requirements. The one is you cannot have a service that's longer than 2 hours. And then the second requirement is that you've got to have a 30-minute gap between each service. And there isn't any suggestion that you can have rolling congregations in the same place of worship. But over and above that, if you take into account that the intention behind this is to curb the spread of the virus, if you're not cleaning after every congregation, I'm sure Uzair will be able to comment on it, but you do probably increase the risk of infection and the spread of the virus. So I do think we need to think carefully about whether we have rolling congregations with short intervals.
The second question then is about sites that are not sites of worship per se. So, for example, community halls. If a particular area, you have a number of Muslims, all of them are not going to be able to make it to the masjid. Can you then have congregations for Salah or for Jummah in community halls? Would that concession now of up to 50 people allow for congregation at halls, or is it specific only to places of worship?
At the moment, the directions are limited to places of worship. But I think there's a number of our masjids that have adjoining halls, and I think that's a suggestion that UCSA should take up with the In Transformation initiative, so that we can get the directions relaxed a little further, so that you can have a separate Jamaat, for example, in an adjoining hall. But I think you will need to ensure that you have separate entrances, you have a separate register, etc., so that at least the protocols are in place.
Another question is with regards liability, right? What if the imam follows all the protocols and all the guidelines, but some Muslims just refuse to comply? Can he still be held legally responsible? Or in another scenario, what if the imam is willing to comply, but his trustees insist on doing certain things which will fall foul of the regulations, or vice versa? The trustees want to abide, but the imam doesn't abide. How will it work legally in that sense?
So I think at the end of the day, it's a question of who carries ultimate responsibility in that particular masjid. I would think that the imam is a fairly important member of that particular community and will have a great say in that particular community. And if the imam is choosing to ignore the directions, then I think the imam is exposing himself to liability. But if the imam asks people to comply with the directions and the trustees refuse to do so, my advice to the imam is he should document that in a letter or an email, so at least he has something to cover himself. And he may want to consider whether under those circumstances he should continue leading that congregation in prayer, because if the police arrive and he's leading a congregation in prayer, and for example, they're standing shoulder to shoulder, the police may very well decide that they're arresting the imam because they see him as the leader of that particular congregation. So I would hope that our communities and our trustees are sensible and they don't place the imam in such an invidious position.
Okay, before I let you go, Aslam, another question has come in that this aspect of social distancing, it is a requirement as per the regulations. I think that's quite clear. But there seems to be legal opinion floating around that it's not a criminal offense and you cannot be arrested. So it's not something that you have to take all that seriously. At worst, they'll ask you, if they come into a masjid and they see that there isn't this distancing, they'll ask you to please comply. But there's no need to be so proactive in this regard from a legal perspective. Health is a separate matter because it's not really a criminal offense. Your thoughts on that?
I think the people that are advocating those views are basing those views on a document that has been developed as a code of conduct for the police. And this is after the Mr. Khoza case, who, as you will recall, the allegation is that he was beaten by the police to death in his home. And after a court case, the court had ordered government to develop a protocol and guidelines in relation to the behavior of the police and the army. Now, in that particular document, it stipulates that you ought to warn people to start complying with social distancing. That doesn't mean that an imam, for example, cannot be held responsible. It may be that the congregants in that particular congregation will be told, will not all be arrested, but that doesn't stop them from arresting the imam or the committee member that's in charge on the day.
All right, Aslam, shukran so much. I know there'll be probably many more questions, but we'll ask for the attendees here to somehow engage you on a direct basis, inshallah.
Inshallah, no problem at all, Mura.
Jazakumullah. Dr. Uzair, if you could come up quickly, there's a few questions pertaining to the medical aspect of things.
Yes. So there is one question that I see on the top here. Okay, so if anyone responds yes to any one of the screening questions, they should not be allowed to enter the masjid. They should be advised to consult the medical practitioner, because those symptoms are the basic. So even when people are doing community screening and you notice that the community healthcare workers are going to the houses, if you respond yes to any one of those questions, then they actually test you for COVID. And the big challenge that we're going to have going forward now is that we're entering the influenza season. So people are not going to be able to distinguish between influenza and COVID. And even if one person comes with influenza to the masjid, they're likely to spread it to everyone else. So if any person answered yes to any one of the questions, they should not be allowed to enter the masjid. They should be asked to consult the medical practitioner. Number two is I see that the regulations stipulate that it's 50 per venue, not 50 per floor. And I think we need to be very clear about that. And the last one is about the congregation around when you leave the masjid and in those high contact areas. I think it's important that that we stress those points, that people need to leave in batches and need to leave as quickly as possible. And the other important thing, and I think that's something that I will discuss with the IMA, is regarding the education with respect to the appropriate wearing of the mask, because we can't leave our noses and our mouths open when we wearing these masks, and because we have this tendency to drop them and we can't breathe. So if you in open fresh air, yes, you can drop the mask below your nose, but you actually need to wear your mask. And importantly, I noticed even today that people were not coming with their mask to the masjid, and we can't allow you into the masjid if you don't come with your mask, because that's within the regulation. So those are some of the things that I think I need to address, and the others we can always address.
Yeah, two more quick questions. Right, the one common question that's being asked is about the need for the social distancing in Salah if you've already got the mask. The messages that are circulating seem to suggest that the mouth is closed, the nose is closed. So why do you still need a gap? And why specifically 1.5 meters? If you can clarify that.
Okay, so one of the things that I posted a response to the message was, number one, the 1.5 meters originally arose when you remember with this virus we're learning every day. New knowledge has been emanated because of the different areas and the different ways that the virus, that information has been accumulated. So initially the thinking was that this was through droplet spread, which means that a person could cough or person could talk, and this droplet would then travel a distance of 1.5 meters, and which was likely that somebody could touch the fomite within that area and actually then spread the virus themselves. But now, in my opinion, even the 1.5 meters might be irrelevant, because the thing is, it's ideally to have that space, because now we're talking about airborne transmission, where it's spread through even minor spread. So which means that the mask protects me from spreading the virus to somebody else, but doesn't protect me from acquiring the virus from somebody else. Okay, so we need to remember that. So the mask is not a solution to prevent you from getting the infection. It just will reduce the amount of virus that's been emanated from somebody else's mouth. So which means that you still can acquire the infection even if you have a mask on. So the next thing is we also need to remember that in our sajda and in our ruku, we are reciting the tasbih, Subhana Rabbiyal A'la and Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, which means that whatever we're doing is also emanating from our mouth. So it's important that we consider all these things. And when it comes again, and one of those things that I tend to look at very this thing is that, again, what I said at the beginning, it's not about compliance. It's about the protection of everyone else. So if we continue to ask these questions about 1.5 meters, why 1 meter, 1.5 meter, it's what's best that we can do to protect everyone else that we come into contact with.
And then lastly, the issue of sanitizers. The 70% alcohol-based sanitizers, is there any health side effects? Is it in any way harmful to the skin? And what is the nature of that alcohol that is utilized in those sanitizers?
Okay, so we need to go back and look at what was originally sent. So it's either 60% ethanol or isopropanol. So these are synthetic alcoholic formulations. So they're not pure alcohol, that the one that people can get intoxicated with. But the problem with them might be is that if you have an allergy or you have a problem, and sometimes what happens is people will rub their hands and they rub their nose or their mouth, and then they will probably end up with a headache because of the fumes that emanate from them. So it's important that people take those precautions. And if you have eczema and you have allergy to these things, then the ideal would be using soap and water. And sometimes at one point in time, some of us were considering that, you get the green bar sunlight soap. If people could rub their hand with that on both sides and not wash it thereafter and then enter the masjid, it will also serve the same purpose.
All right. Jazakumullah so much, Doc. Allah Ta'ala reward you.
Ameen, inshallah.
And we'd like to say Jazakumullah to all those who did presentations this evening, and to all those who came on as attendees on the webinar, and all those listening on the various radio platforms and online live platforms. May Allah Ta'ala reward one and all. May Allah Ta'ala make it easy for us, inshallah. If there are any follow-up questions, then feel free to contact the Jamiatul Ulama South Africa, who have hosted this webinar this evening. We'll conclude with the Sunnah Dua. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.